Picture the dusty plains of the Old West silent but for the relentless whistle of the wind. A single wagon stands motionless, riddled with bullet holes, an eerie monument to a ruthless ambush. A woman trembling with shock and heartbreak rises from the sparse brush, her hands stained with desert dust. She is Harriet Winston, mother of two small twins, all that remains of a once hopeful caravan. Bandits have left no survivors. Or so they think. The woman's gaze burns with sorrow and ferocious resolve as she clutches a desperate secret to her chest. This secret will become the catalyst for vengeance, heartbreak, and the unstoppable force of a mother's love. Harriet Winston could still recall the optimism that fluttered through her chest when she and her husband Thomas packed their modest belongings into a creaky wooden wagon. Their young twins, Sarah and Samuel, each barely 5 years old, bounced around with uncontainable excitement, little feet thumping on the planks as they chattered about seeing buffalo and wide-open skies. The world beyond their small homestead in Iowa had seemed filled with promise. They were headed west, toward new opportunities, chasing a whisper of land that might bring them the fresh start they'd dreamed of for so long. The trek began in a caravan of wagons, numbering 5 in total. Harriet had never met some of the other travelers before, but they quickly became a family of sorts, sharing meals and exchanging stories by the fire each night. There was old Mrs. Sullivan, who knitted scarves she hoped to sell in distant towns, the Jenkins family longing to set up a store in a new settlement, and Tay Peterson brothers, who talked about prospecting for gold. The air was thick with hope, laced with the spice of frontier danger, an unspoken awareness that the West could be both generous and deadly. Thomas, a steady man, with a wry grin and a heart of gold, would grasp Harriet's hand during quieter moments of the journey. He often reassured her that whatever hardships awaited them, they would face them together. Harriet would turn to their slumbering twins, nestled under blankets, and she'd feel her worries ease. For if there was one thing Harriet believed, it was that a united family could endure any storm on the horizon. Weeks into their journey, the travelers grew weary from the unrelenting heat of the daytime sun and the chill that clung to their bodies at night. Sarah and Samuel, despite their playful innocence, began to sense the strain among the adults. The slow, punishing trek across arid plains left water supplies dwindling and tempers occasionally fraying. It was during this time that another wagon master, Martin Frisk, began warning everyone about increased bandit activity. Rumors of a vicious gang roamed through every roadside tavern's conversations. He'd heard from a passerby that this gang, allegedly led by a man called Blackjack Murdock, was infamous for robbing unsuspecting caravans. Harriet and Thomas exchanged uneasy glances at the mention of Murdock's name, but they pressed forward. Even with the threat of outlaws turning back after all they'd invested wasn't an option. During a pit stop near a small watering hole, Harriet watched as Thomas carefully rationed what little water remained. The children giggled and splashed at the edge of the shallow pool, but Harriet couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. It felt like the land itself was warning them, a hush falling over the wind, whenever Harriet ventured a glance at the horizon. And though she could never have guessed precisely what awaited them, she sensed a darkness looming ahead. On the eve of the massacre, the group set up camp near a sparse patch of brush and cacti. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of copper and red. Harriet remembered how earlier that day she'd overheard one of the Peterson brothers boasting about the revolver strapped to his hip. He claimed no bandit with sense would risk an assault on a well-armed caravan. Everyone seemed to relax a little at his bravado, though Harriet found it hard to settle her nerves. That night, Thomas sat beside Harriet, pressing his lips gently against her temple. Their twins slept in the wagon faces, flushed with a day of dusty adventures. Harriet remembered clinging to that moment of peace, her husband's warm presence a comforting anchor. She thought of their future homestead, a small ranch or farmland where their children could run free. The tension of bandit rumors seemed almost distant, overshadowed by her belief in a new life. But the desert can be deceiving, offering false tranquility in one breath and cruel fury in the next. It was silent when Harriet finally drifted off, a shallow sleep, weighed down by misgivings. The flicker of distant lightning revealed silhouettes of rolling plains, as if nature itself anticipated a coming storm. If Harriet had known how quickly everything would change, she might have fought harder to resist exhaustion. Instead, she let sleep claim her, unaware that fate was already in motion. The massacre struck just before dawn, when the horizon was tinted a faint bluish hue. Harriet awoke to the sound of gunfire ripping through the stillness. Screams echoed off the plains, followed by the thunder of horses' hooves. In the chaos, Harriet lurched upright, her heart pounding so fiercely she thought her chest might shatter. She peered out from the wagon's flap to see dark figures galloping in circles around the camp muzzle flashes, lighting up the gloom. Thomas had already bolted from the wagon, rifle in hand. Harriet could see his silhouette as he fired desperately at their assailants. Another shot rang out closer, and the shriek of a wounded horse tore through the air. She saw a flicker of flame in the distance. One of the bandits' torches soared through the sky, landing near a cluster of supplies. The wagon master, Martin Frisk, crumpled to the ground when a bullet struck him in the chest. Harriet's heart hammered at the realization that bandits swarmed the campsite like a plague of locusts, outnumbering the travelers. The children shrieked from within the wagon, awakened by the carnage. Mind racing, Harriet grabbed them by their small, trembling hands, resolved to keep them safe, if it cost her her own life. She threw open the flap at the rear of the wagon. Nad stumbled out into the dusty brush behind them. In the dim pre-dawn light, she could barely see, but the whistle of bullets overhead fueled her desperation to hide her precious twins. Harriet led Sarah and Samuel to a patch of brush just beyond the circle of violence. She coaxed them to huddle low, each child trembling. Their eyes shimmered with terror, and Harriet's own tears threatened to spill. She stroked their hair and pressed a small canteen of water to their lips, whispering every ounce of motherly reassurance she could muster. Stay here and stay silent. No matter what happens, do not come out. She quickly realized she had to return to find Thomas. She also knew she couldn't bear to leave the twins alone for long. Every shred of maternal instinct screamed at her to keep them within arm's reach. But as she surveyed the flickering lights and swirling dust from the distant camp, Harriet understood that if she and Thomas had any hope of keeping the children alive, it might involve splitting for just a moment in the chaos. With hurried kisses to each child's forehead, she ensured they were hidden under the brush's tight leaves. She steeled herself, turning back toward the campsite to find her husband. The thought of abandoning her trembling twins, even for a second, tore her heart in two. But Harriet felt the urgent pull of love and duty. She had to return, for if Thomas was wounded or pinned down, he would need her, and if there was any chance to stop the bandits, they would have to fight together. The moment Harriet emerged from behind the brush, the full scope of the horror struck her. The faint glimmer of dawn revealed wagons aflame, bodies scattered across the dusty ground, some fallen in desperate attempts to protect their families, others shot in the back while trying to run. Flames crackled the heat, singeing her face, and acrid smoke choked the air. She scurried from one overturned wagon to another, scanning through the chaos for a glimpse of Thomas. Shouts cut through the mayhem, orders barked by the bandits, and feeble cries from the wounded travelers. From the corner of her eye, Harriet saw the Peterson brothers lying in a pool of their own blood, their guns still clutched in cold fingers. A sob caught in her throat, but adrenaline forced her forward. She needed to find Thomas. Every muscle in her body urged Harriet to vanish back into the desert, to return to the twins and flee as far from this carnage as possible. Yet her heart refused to leave without Thomas. She darted between shadows, ducking behind crates, her blood pounding. Then came a flash of a muzzle, and a bullet tore through the crate beside her. The wood splintered in her face, and Harriet dropped low, pressing herself to the ground. Her ears rang from the onslaught of gunfire. Somewhere ahead she glimpsed the flick of Thomas's dusty brown jacket. Harriet found Thomas crouched behind an overturned wagon wheel. He clutched his rifled teeth, gritted with pain. Her eyes followed the trail of blood staining his leg. He'd been shot, the bullet lodged somewhere in his thigh. Recognition flickered in his eyes when he saw Harriet, relief mingled with horror. "Harry," he rasped, voice trembling with both dread and devotion. "Where are the twins?" "They're safe," Harriet managed between shallow breaths. She offered him her shoulder, trying to help him stand. But Thomas grimaced, legs buckling. Fresh gunshots popped off nearby, and Harriet's heart hammered with frantic urgency. "We have to get out of here," she urged. Thomas grasped her hand, his knuckles white. "Harriet, you have to go," he whispered fiercely. "Take the children and run. There are too many of them." The finality in his tone tore at Harriet's chest. She tried to argue, but a bandit's shot whizzed overhead, burying itself in the wagon wheel. Panic spiked in her veins. In that moment, Thomas willed every ounce of love into his gaze. "Don't let them be orphans," he said, tears brimming in his eyes. Harriet choked on her own sob, pressed a trembling kiss to Thomas's lips, then crawled backward as he fumbled to raise his rifle once more. A part of her soul howled in protest. She wanted to stay, to drag him away, but the ring of gunfire hammered the reality home. If she hesitated any longer, the twins were doomed. Thomas mouthed, "I love you," before turning his weapon toward approaching shadows. As Harriet scurried away, she dared one last glance over her shoulder. Her vision blurred with tears, but she saw the muzzle flash from Thomas's rifle. She saw him bring down one bandit, then another. She saw a bandit slip behind him with a drawn revolver. Harriet wanted to scream, but no sound came out. A single shot echoed, and Thomas sagged the rifle, slipping from his hand. Harriet's breath caught in her chest, disbelief and heartbreak flooding her. In the swirl of smoke and dust, Harriet's memory of that moment cut off. Her limbs moved of their own accord, propelling her back toward the brush, where her twins lay hidden. She didn't dare cry out in grief. To do so might reveal her hiding place. Instead, her tears fell silently, mingling with the soot that coated her cheeks. When she reached the brush, she found Sarah and Samuel cowering, their small faces streaked with tears. Harriet sank to her knees, drawing them both into her arms with fierce desperation. She could only whisper, "We have to go," again and again, as if trying to convince herself that flight was even possible now. The suffocating grief would have to wait. Eventually, the gunfire ebbed, replaced by eerie, ringing silence. Harriet remained motionless, in the brush arms wrapped around her children's hearts, beating in a synchronized terror. Smoke wafted toward them, in acrid plumes stinging their eyes. Through the haze, Harriet could see the silhouettes of the bandits. Men on horseback circled the wagons, rummaging for loot. Now and then, she heard a distant shout or scuffle, likely a final dispatch of Tay injured. The bandits' laughter was coarse and cruel, a fiendish glee at their successful slaughter. Harriet clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms with such force that blood beaded. She held a hand over Samuel's mouth when the little boy's sob slipped out. Harriet willed him to be silent. The bandits were far enough away not to notice a stifled whimper, but she could not take any chances. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Harriet dared not move, waiting for the nightmarish shapes on horseback to vanish over the horizon. She glimpsed the bandits riding away, carrying sacks stuffed with stolen valuables. They didn't pause to check the brush, apparently content with the massacre they'd wrought. Harriet kept waiting, her body going numb, until every last hoofbeat faded into the distance. When Harriet was certain the bandits had truly gone, she gingerly guided the twins out of the brush. Sarah clutched Harriet's skirt, eyes wide and uncomprehending. Samuel, usually so inquisitive, said nothing too traumatized to ask where his father was. Harriet prayed they wouldn't have to see the carnage up close, but there was no alternative. If they remained hidden, thirst and hunger would claim them in days. The campsite was a smoldering ruin of charred wood, broken wagons, and most heartbreakingly lifeless bodies. Harriet tried to guide the children around the worst of it, but they were forced to witness more than any child should. Flies had already begun to swarm under the dawning sun. Each step felt like wading through a nightmare. Harriet's hand shook as she covered Sarah's eyes when the little girl let out a ragged sob at the sight of a neighbor's body. Yet Harriet was compelled to check each fallen traveler, hoping, if foolishly, for any sign of life. She found none. She didn't linger over Thomas's body, knowing she would collapse with grief if she did. Instead, Harriet whispered a trembling prayer beneath her breath, tears streaking her cheeks as she bent to kiss his cooling forehead. She forced herself to move on Samuel and Sarah in tow. The twins needed her more than ever. Harriet's survival instincts took over. She salvaged what supplies she could from the wreckage: a dented canteen of water, a few sacks of cornmeal, and jerky. She rummaged a battered knife from a broken trunk, stuffing it into her belt. Her hands shook, and Sarah's eyes never left her face. Harriet found a discarded poncho that smelled of sweat and soot and draped it over her shoulders. The sun would grow fierce soon, and the nights in the desert would still be mercilessly cold. With no horses left, they'd all been stolen or killed. Harriet understood their only hope lay in walking to the nearest settlement. She faintly remembered the wagon master mentioning a place called Cedar Vale, a small frontier town that might be a 3-day journey if they could keep a steady pace. 3 days felt like a lifetime out here, but Harriet had no other plan. Gripping each child's hand, she turned west, the direction in which the caravan had been heading, and began the long walk. They trudged across barren stretches of sage and cactus for hours. Heat waves shimmered on the horizon, promising illusions of water that never materialized. Harriet took small sips from the canteen, rationing the precious water meticulously. She tore strips of her skirt to make a makeshift turban around the twins' heads, shielding them from the sun as best she could. Their footfalls were slow, the children stumbling with exhaustion. Each time one of them faltered, Harriet scooped them up, balancing the weight between her arms. The emotional toll weighed heavier than the physical. Harriet couldn't shake the memory of Thomas falling, that final muzzle flash. She suppressed sobs that threatened to overtake her because her children's survival depended on her composure. She pressed on with grim resolve, her protective instincts fueling every step. If grief conquered her now, it would conquer them all. Late in the afternoon, when Harriet's legs trembled and her lips were chapped from thirst, the faint silhouette of a rider appeared on the horizon. Fear jolted through her. Could it be a bandit returning to finish what had been started? But Harriet saw only one horseman. If it was one of Murdock's men, she might still have a chance to hide the children. As the rider drew closer, Harriet's heart pounded. The stranger wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow across his face. When he finally came within earshot, he lifted a hand in greeting. Harriet tensed, ready to shield her children behind her. She gripped the small knife concealed beneath the poncho. "Ma'am," the rider called out, halting his horse. He seemed taken aback by Harriet's disheveled appearance and the obvious terror etched on her features. "You look like you've been through hell." Harriet didn't relax, but she managed a raspy plea. "Are you alone?" The man nodded. "Name's Charles Browning, ma'am. I'm a traveling salesman peddling basic goods." He eyed the trembling twins, his expression softening. "You folks need water." Cautious Harriet nodded. Charles dismounted, rummaging through his saddlebag until he produced a canteen. He offered it to Harriet, and she let the children drink first. When Harriet finally took a sip, relief and gratitude coursed through her. Despite her wariness, Harriet felt she had no choice but to trust this stranger for now. Sitting on a patch of dusty ground, Harriet recounted the events of the massacre. She explained how bandits had ambushed the caravan at dawn, how they had left no one alive except her and the twins, saved only by pure luck and the concealment of brush. Charles's weathered face grew grim as he listened, eyes narrowing at the mention of Blackjack Murdock. "I've heard of Blackjack," Charles said, voice taut with anger. "His gang has robbed stagecoaches near Abilene. I never heard about him slaughtering families, though. He's usually about the gold and loot." Harriet looked down, tears threatening to overflow. "They murdered everyone. My husband, Her voice gave out. Charles, though a stranger, placed a hand on her shoulder in silent sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It's a cruel land out here." He let Harriet compose herself before continuing. "I can take you to Cedar Vale. It's about 2 days' ride from here. If I walk alongside my horse Uo, and the twins can ride. It'll be slower, but safer than traveling on foot." Though Harriet still harbored suspicion anyone could be a threat in these unforgiving plains, she accepted Charles's offer. Putting her children's needs first, she helped them onto the horse, climbing up behind them. Charles led the horse on foot, guiding it along a faint wagon trail Harriet recognized as the route her caravan had planned to follow. They traveled in uneasy silence for much of the day. Sarah clung to Harriet's waist, while Samuel dozed fitfully against Harriet's back, occasionally whimpering from nightmares of gunfire. Whenever Harriet met Charles's eyes, she saw a protective glint, perhaps spurred by fatherly instinct, or a simple sense of human decency. Harriet tried to stifle her waves of grief. Practical tasks, like ensuring the children were hydrated and adjusting the horse's pace, gave her a lifeline to cling to. By evening, Charles found a small oasis, a meager pond, surrounded by spindly mesquite trees. They decided to camp there for the night. Harriet helped gather firewood, while Charles tended to the horse, brushing its coat and murmuring soothing words. Sarah and Samuel sat close to the flickering fire, eyes vacant from the day's hardships. Harriet wondered if her children would ever be the same again, if any future could erase the horror they had witnessed. Over a simple meal of jerky and bread, Charles shared bits of his story. He came from a struggling Missouri farm, deciding to try his luck as a traveling merchant once droughts ruined his crops. He spoke of losing 2 siblings to typhoid fever, forging an unspoken bond of tragedy with Harriet. In turn, Harriet revealed only fragments of her past, how she and Thomas had dreamed of a ranch out west, and how that dream lay in ashes. Before they bedded down, Charles quietly promised Harriet he'd help her see justice done if that was what she wanted. No one should get away with slaughtering an entire caravan, he said, voice low with conviction. Harriet didn't respond, but the determination that flared within her was answer enough. They reached Cedar Vale just before noon on the second day. The town was modest, a cluster of wooden buildings lining a rutted dirt street with a humble saloon at one end and a livery stable at the other. A couple of scrawny dogs wandered aimlessly while a handful of townspeople paused to watch Charles and Harriet enter. Dust swirled in a breeze that carried the faint smell of livestock and sweat. Charles escorted Harriet and the twins to the local inn run by a stern but not unkind woman named Martha Albright. Her grey hair was pinned in a tight bun, and her sharp gaze flicked over Harriet's worn, soot-streaked clothes and the trembling children. Without prying, Martha arranged a small room, remarking that she would supply a basin of warm water and some extra blankets. Once the children were settled, Harriet thanked Charles profusely. He brushed it off. "It's what decent people do," he said. Harriet's grip on his hand lingered for a moment. She realized how rare decency could be in this lawless land. She hated that she'd initially feared him. But in a place where murderers lurked along dusty trails, distrust was a survival mechanism. That afternoon, Harriet steeled herself and, with Charles at her side, made her way to the sheriff's office to report the massacre. Sheriff Angus MacLeod was a hulking Scotsman with greying mutton chops and discerning eyes. He listened attentively as Harriet described the attack, occasionally jotting notes in a battered ledger. When Harriet identified Jed Blackjack Murdock, the sheriff let out a weary sigh. "We've had trouble with Murdock's men," before MacLeod explained. "Mostly stagecoach robberies near the outskirts, but never anything on this scale." He slammed the ledger shut. "Murdock's cunning, slipperier than a rattlesnake. We've never had enough evidence or manpower to bring him in." Charles frowned, leaning on the officer's wooden desk. "Sheriff, they slaughtered families, children. We can't let him get away with that." Sheriff MacLeod nodded gravely. "I'll send word to some nearby towns, Dodge City, Abilene. We'll see if any lawman can spare help. In the meantime," he regarded Harriet with something akin to pity, "you'd best get some rest. If Murdock is anywhere near, I don't want you or your children stepping outside alone." News of the massacre spread through Cedar Vale like wildfire. In the saloon, hushed conversations buzzed around Harriet's story. A traveling gambler claimed he saw Murdock in Wichita weeks ago, while an aging cattle driver insisted he recognized Harriet's face from a wanted poster, though Harriet was certain he was confusing her with someone else. Whispers of fear swelled. If Murdock was willing to slaughter an entire caravan, perhaps no one in Cedar Vale was safe. Martha Albright stopped by Harriet's room with extra towels and a small container of lavender-scented soap. Harriet thanked her, surprised at the gesture of kindness in such a harsh environment. Martha patted Harriet's hand, and with eyes tart, hinted at a rough past of her own, quietly said, "I'm sorry about your loss. If you need anything, you come to me." Everywhere Harriet went, cautious sympathy followed. She hated the attention, hated reliving the trauma every time someone asked if it was true she'd seen her husband murdered. But she recognized that in a remote town like Cedar Vale, empathy and caution were commodities shared among the wounded souls carving out a life in the frontier. She felt a small flicker of gratitude that at least for the moment, she and her children had a roof over their heads and a measure of safety. Nighttime was the worst. Harriet found herself unable to sleep more than a few restless hours. Images of the massacre plagued her dreams: Thomas's last stand, the flames licking at wagon wheels, the hollow-eyed bandits ransacking the campsite. She'd wake in a cold sweat, sometimes choking back a scream to avoid waking Sarah and Samuel. The children had nightmares of their own. Sarah, always the more sensitive, would wake sobbing, gasping for breath as she relived the gunshots. Samuel, stoic in his waking hours, would cry silently into his pillow until Harriet rushed to hold him. She'd stroke his hair and whisper that they were safe now, though Harriet herself wasn't fully convinced. In the faint glow of a lantern, Harriet would rock her children, struggling to soothe them, while her own sorrow and anger simmered. She had no illusions that life would simply return to normal. The West rarely allowed for neat resolutions. Still, Harriet refused to let her children live in perpetual fear. Even as her heart ached, she resolved to see Murdock brought to justice. It was what Thomas would have wanted. Days turned into a week. Sheriff McLeod's efforts to raise a posse or summon outside help proved slow, hindered by bureaucracy and the dangerous distances between towns. Harriet grew impatient. She spent hours on the porch of the inn, staring at the dusty main road that led out of Cedar Vale, wondering where Murdock might be. She pictured him perched in some desert hideout, counting his loot and planning his next strike without remorse for the lives he had destroyed. One evening, Harriet confided her frustrations in Charles. They stood under the inn's overhang, watching a rare desert rain drizzle onto the street. "I can't stand waiting," she said through gritted teeth. "The sheriff might never find him." Meanwhile, Sarah and Samuel wake up every night screaming. Charles nodded, chewing on his bottom lip. "I've been thinking the same. I'm heading north soon, maybe to Wichita. I've got business there, but I also want to ask around about Murdock. Word travels fast in saloons." He hesitated before adding, "If you're thinking about going after him yourself, I'd advise caution. This man is dangerous." Harriet exhaled slowly, her mind set. "I can't rest, not until he pays for what he did." The following morning, Harriet took the twins for a walk through Cedar Vale. She wanted them to get fresh air, to see something other than the four walls of their room. As they passed the livery stable, Harriet noticed an old wanted poster tacked to a wooden post. The face was scruffy, a thick mustache overshadowing thin lips, and the name Jed Blackjack Murdock burned into Harriet's mind. Tay Bounty was significant, but Harriet doubted anyone would be brave enough to chase him for that sum alone. Later, Harriet cornered a traveling stagecoach driver in front of the saloon. The man who called himself Bert McClary had just arrived with mail and passengers. Harriet asked if he'd heard of Murdock's gang. Bert shrugged. "Saw a suspicious group near the Kansas-Oklahoma border. Rumor says Murdock has a hideout out that way near a place called Wolf Canyon. It's a rough patch of land, lots of ravines, perfect for outlaws to vanish into." Harriet thanked him, her heart pounding. Wolf Canyon. She repeated the name in her head, determined not to forget. That night, Harriet sat with a cup of thin coffee, replaying the day's conversation in her mind. She remembered how quiet Sarah and Samuel had been after their walk, how they huddled close whenever someone passed by with a gun at their hip. Harriet reached out, pulling her children near, wishing she could absorb their fear and banish it forever. Her mind spun with possibilities. She considered telling the sheriff about Wolf Canyon, but her intuition told her he already suspected that. She also doubted he had the manpower or the fortitude to march into Murdock's stronghold unannounced. Harriet cradled her mug, its warmth doing little to soothe the chill in her bones, and closed her eyes. Images of Thomas wounded, then killed stuttered through her thoughts. She saw the bandits' dust-covered boots, stepping over lifeless bodies, heard the crowing laughter as they looted valuables. Her stomach twisted, and her heart pounded with an unyielding thirst for retribution. More than that, she wanted to ensure that no other family would face Murdock's brutality. Determined not to remain idle, Harriet sought out Charles at the saloon the next morning. Despite the early hour, the saloon was stirring with travelers grabbing breakfast. Charles was seated at a table near the corner, sipping a cup of coffee. His eyes lit with guarded curiosity when he saw Harriet stride in. She slid into the seat opposite him, leaning forward intently. "I need your help," she said in a low, urgent tone. "I've learned Murdock may be hiding in or near Wolf Canyon. If the sheriff won't do anything, then I will." Charles's brow knotted with concern. "Harriet, you're talking about marching into a nest of vipers. Do you have any idea how many men Murdock might have T.I. him?" Harriet's eyes glistened with a fierce resolve. "I know it's dangerous, but I can't let fear hold me back. If we wait for the law to move, it might be too late. Murdock won't stop slaughtering and robbing." Charles set his cup down carefully, a swirl of steam rising between them. "I can't let you do this alone. I might know a few folks who'd be willing to stand up for what's right. But you have to be clear, this is vigilante justice. We're stepping outside the law. Are you sure you're willing to risk that?" She nodded firmly. There was no hesitation in her voice. "For my children, and for all the families Murdock has destroyed, I have to." Charles managed to gather a small band of volunteers, men who had lost property to outlaws or who simply believed in protecting innocence in a land where law enforcement was scarce. Among them was a wiry tracker named Clement Shaw, known for his uncanny ability to navigate the labyrinth of canyons and arroyos. Another was a retired Army scout, Henry Jackson, who had a quiet demeanor but a lethal aim with his rifle. In a private meeting in the livery stable's loft, Harriet met these men. She stood before them, her posture straight, but her voice laced with raw emotion. "I won't lie," she said. "I want to see Murdock pay for what he did to my family, to all those families. But I also want to make sure no one else suffers the same. I can't do it alone, and I'm grateful for your help." The men exchanged nods, each carrying their own brand of Western stoicism. For a moment, Harriet's eyes flicked away, feeling both relief and guilt that others would risk their lives on her behalf. But the expressions she read on their faces told her they were equally tired of living under the shadow of bandits. The plan was to head north at dusk, following a lesser-known trail that, according to Clement Shaw, would lead them near Wolf Canyon's outskirts without attracting too much attention. Harriet spent the afternoon packing supplies. She would leave Sarah and Samuel in Cedar Vale in the care of Martha Albright. The thought of parting from her children again after nearly losing them forever shook Harriet to her core, but she couldn't imagine dragging them into such peril. Before sunset, Harriet knelt by the bed where her twins sat, their small hands clenched in their laps. She explained gently that she needed to do something important, and taught Miss Martha would watch over them until she returned. Sarah's lip quivered, and Samuel looked away, but neither child protested. Harriet realized they had grown up too quickly, in a matter of days, painfully aware that their mother might not come back. She gave each twin a fierce hug, pressing kisses to their foreheads and whispering her love. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she forced them back, not wanting to scare her children. Then she pulled a thin, silver chain from her neck, a small locket that contained a miniature portrait of their family and placed it in Sarah's hand. "Hold this for me," she said softly. "It'll remind you I'm always with you." Harriet and her small band of would-be vigilantes set off under a reddening sky. Clement led the way on a sturdy bay horse, scanning the terrain for fresh tracks or signs of outlaws. Charles followed, with Harriet riding alongside him, her heart pounding with trepidation and grim determination. Henry Jackson trailed behind, his rifle angled across his saddle. Two other men, Jonas and Clive, brought up the rear, each sporting a revolver on his hip. The night air felt cooler, a welcome respite from the blazing heat of day. It also lent a cloak of secrecy to their expedition. Harriet wore a borrowed hat and a long coat, feeling both awkward and resolute in her newly adopted frontier attire. She'd learned to shoot a rifle in her youth, Thomas had taught her, believing every pioneer wife should know how, but she had never fired at a person. The memory of the massacre still flashed like lightning across her mind, fueling a cold, methodical rage. They traveled until the moon rose overhead, pale and watchful. They camped near a creek, no fire lit, for fear of attracting unwelcome eyes. Harriet's body ached with exhaustion, but sleep was elusive. She lay awake, gazing at the stars in silent prayer, yearning for the moment when she could return to her twins with the assurance that vengeance had been served. By mid-afternoon the next day, the group reached the edges of Wolf Canyon. The air grew still, the rocky walls rising around them like silent sentinels. Clement dismounted, scouting ahead on foot. He returned an hour later, reporting he'd found traces of a camp, a half-burned fire pit, and scattered footprints. "They're here," he said grimly. "Could be Murdock's men, could be travelers. Hard to say." Harriet's pulse fluttered. She glanced at Charles, who gave her a reassuring nod. They pressed on cautiously, navigating the narrow trails that snaked between towering walls of red rock. Now and then, Harriet caught sight of the sky, a thin strip of azure overhead. Everything else felt claustrophobic and tense, like the canyon could swallow them at any moment. Toward dusk, they spotted smoke curling from a hidden draw. The group hunkered down behind a ridge, using binoculars to scan a makeshift encampment below. Harriet's breath caught in her throat. She recognized one of the bandits, a wiry man with a scarred cheek from the morning of the ambush. Her grip on the rifle tightened. Then she saw him, Blackjack Murdock. He wore a wide-brimmed black hat, dark hair falling to his shoulders. Even from a distance, Harriet could sense his air of authority. He strutted around the camp, barking orders at his men. A muscle in Harriet's jaw clenched. This was the man responsible for the slaughter of her husband, her neighbors, and countless others. Charles lowered the binoculars, exhaling slowly. "He's got at least 8 or 9 men down there," he muttered. "Maybe more." Clement pursed his lips. "I counted 6 tents. Hard to say how many might be out on a job. We should wait for nightfall, see what we're up against when they settle in." Harriet's heart thrummed in her chest. Patience was not her strong suit right now, but she understood the logic. A reckless charge could end in their deaths. She glared down at the encampment, remembering the anguished cries of families. She swore to herself that Murdock's reign of terror would end here if she had any say. Night fell slowly, the canyon walls darkening into looming shapes. Murdock's men lit a few lanterns, scattering a soft glow across their campsite. Harriet's group inched closer. They found a higher ledge that overlooked the clearing, a vantage point from which they could plan an ambush. Clement, quiet as a ghost, crawled on his belly to the edge, scanning the camp with careful eyes. The men in Harriet's group conferred in hushed whispers. Henry Jackson removed his wide-brimmed hat and ran calloused fingers over his weathered face. Even if we get the drop on them, we're outnumbered. We need to pick them off strategically. He glanced at Harriet, uncertain. Ma'am, you sure you want to be right in the thick of it? Harriet nodded without hesitation. I have to see this through, she said. I know how to shoot. She tried to keep the tremor out of her voice, recalling the weight of the rifle in her hands during that first day with Thomas. Charles locked eyes with her. All right, we'll divide into pairs. 2 men on the left flank, 2 on the right, Harriet and I on the ridge. We wait until they're settling in for the night, hopefully half of them asleep. It was a plan laced with hope and risk, but Harriet saw no alternative. She silently prayed that her bullet would find its mark. Hours trickled by. Harriet's muscles ached from lying prone on the rocky ground. She watched as some of the bandits dozed off, slumping against crates or in makeshift cots. Only 2 men appeared to be on guard. Murdock himself lounged near a lantern, flipping through a small journal or ledger. Harriet felt a rising anger at how casual he appeared, as if slaughtering travelers was just another day's work. Around midnight, Charles signaled the others with a low whistle. Harriet braced herself, hands shaking as she gripped the rifle. The next few seconds would be critical. She inhaled slowly, recalling Thomas's advice about remaining calm when aiming. Then Charles fired the first shot, a single crack that shattered the stillness. A guard crumpled his lantern, rolling across the dirt. Chaos erupted. Harriet squeezed the trigger, aiming for a bandit who rushed to his feet, fumbling for a revolver. He collapsed under her shot. Panicked shouts filled the canyon. Murdock sprang up, barking orders, "To arms, we've got company." Henry and Jonas fired from the left flank, taking down 2 bandits before they could return fire. Gunshots sparked in the darkness, muzzle flashes lighting up the confusion. Harriet felt her heart hammer against her ribs, but she kept shooting once, twice, reloading with shaking fingers, repeating the cycle. Amid the gunfire, Harriet suddenly realized that one of Murdock's men had climbed up the ridge behind her. She heard a scrabbling of boots on rock, too late. Before she could spin around, a pistol was pressed to her temple. The bandit hissed, "Don't move, lady, or I'll blow your brains out." Her blood turned to ice. In the flickering moonlight, she saw the glint of mania in the bandit's eyes. He grabbed her arm, yanking her upright. Harriet's mind reeled. She pictured Sarah and Samuel back in Cedar Vale waiting for her. She silently prayed for help. Her left hand fumbled for the knife hidden in her belt, but the man pressed the muzzle harder. Just then, a shot rang out, form behind. The bandit's body jerked. He released Harriet, staggering forward. Harriet whirled to see Charles' pistol smoking. The bandit dropped lifeless. Harriet gasped, tears pricking her eyes from the shock of how close she'd come to death. Charles tugged her arm, motioning her to duck down again. Below, Murdock roared with anger. Half his men were wounded or dead in the initial ambush, but he still rallied the others to return fire. Bullets ricocheted off rock, sending sparks flying. Harriet and Charles inched their way along Tay Ridge, trying to flank Murdock's position. Clement and the others advanced from opposite sides, cornering the outlaws. Suddenly, Harriet spotted Murdock across the clearing. He was crouched behind a boulder, revolver in one hand, rifle slung across his back. Despite the darkness, Harriet felt his eyes lock on her. She shuddered at the memory of that black hat, that cold face. Her rifle trembled. Harriet swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. This was the man who had torn her life apart. With a swift movement, Murdock fired in Harriet's direction. She dodged behind a rocky outcrop, wincing as a bullet grazed her shoulder. The pain seared through her, but adrenaline fueled her determination. She peeked around the rock, returning fire. Her shot missed Murdock by inches, but she heard him snarl. Gradually, the firefight narrowed to Murdock and a couple of his remaining men against Harriet's group. Charles signaled Henry and Jonas to circle around, hoping to corner the outlaws near a dead end in the canyon's rock walls. Harriet pressed a hand to her injured shoulder, grimacing at the sting of warm blood seeping through her coat. She spotted Murdock duck behind an overturned crate, reloading. Summoning courage, Harriet advanced cautiously. She kept her rifle raised, every nerve on edge. Charles followed close behind, covering her flank. Thunder reverberated in Harriet's ears, yet she realized it was only her pounding heartbeat. Another shot rang out, and Harriet dove to the ground, feeling stone fragments scratch her cheek. She scrambled to her knees, rifle aimed at Murdock's last known position. She found him in her sights, crouched and panting. Their eyes met, bridging the short distance. In that moment, Harriet recalled the twisted laughter of Murdock's men, the wagons in flames, her husband falling to dirt. Rage ignited in her chest, coiling through her veins with unstoppable force. She inhaled and squeezed the trigger. Her bullet nicked Murdock's side, tearing into his jacket. He let out a pained grunt, staggering. But he didn't fall. Instead, he glared at Harriet with murderous intensity, spitting blood onto the rocky ground. "So you're the one who got away," he snarled. "Should have made sure there were no survivors. My mistake," he fired back. Harriet dove behind a boulder, her shoulder protesting in agony. Dust kicked up around her as bullets peppered the rocky terrain. She heard Charles exchanging shots with Murdock's men, hoping Clement and the others could handle the reinforcements. Murdock broke from cover, dashing across the clearing, clutching his side. He fired twice, forcing Harriet to keep her head down. By the time she peeked out again, he was nearly past the encampment. Harriet rose, ignoring the burning in her shoulder, and sprinted after him. She heard shouts behind her, Charles calling her name, but Harriet's only thought was catching Murdock before he vanished into the labyrinth of canyons. The chase through Wolf Canyon was a blur of pain and adrenaline. Harriet followed Murdock's staggering silhouette under the pale moonlight, rifle clutched tight. Every step echoed with memories: Thomas's final breath, the burning wagons, her children crying from the brush. She would not let Murdock vanish into the shadows. In a narrow clearing, she caught up. "Stop!" she shouted. He turned, wounded but defiant, his revolver raised. "Should have made sure there were no survivors," he sneered. They stood face to face, weapons drawn, two lives intertwined by violence. "You think you're better than me?" he growled. "You're just another killer with a cause." "I'm a mother," she said, voice breaking. "You made me this." They both fired. The crack of shots echoed through the canyon like thunder. Harriet fell to one knee, blood soaking her coat. But Murdock staggered, dropped his gun, and collapsed. This time, he stayed down. Breathing hard, Harriet stared at the lifeless body. The man who had destroyed her world was gone. But instead of triumph, she felt only aching emptiness. Murdock's end hadn't brought back the dead, but it meant her children would live in a world with one less monster. And for Harriet, that had to be enough. Harriet didn't feel victory as Murdock's body hit the ground, only a wave of searing grief. Her rifle slipped from her grasp, tears streaking her soot-stained face. Thomas was still gone. Gone. Her friends, her neighbors, their dreams gone. Murdock's death couldn't bring them back. Charles reached her side, checking Murdock's pulse, unnecessary but solemn. "It's over?" he said gently. Harriet could barely stand, her wounded shoulder trembling, as Charles helped her to her feet. They gathered what they could from the outlaw camp, loot documents, supplies, then set the hideout ablaze. Smoke rose through the canyon, a silent signal that Murdock's reign had ended. The ride back to Cedar Vale was slow and painful. Harriet fought dizziness from her wound, each hoofbeat jarring her body. But when the town came into view, she sat straighter. At the inn, the twins' voices pierced the air, Mama as they ran into her arms. Harriet dropped to her knees, ignoring the pain, and held them tightly, sobbing into their hair. "I'm here," she whispered over and over. No revenge could undo the loss. But in that moment, wrapped in her children's embrace, Harriet knew one thing for certain: she'd kept her promise. They were safe. Harriet's shoulder mended slowly under Martha Albright's care. Sheriff McLeod stopped by, tipping his hat in quiet respect. Though the raid on Wolf Canyon broke the law, the town treated Harriet and her allies as heroes. Murdock's death had ended a reign of terror, and Cedar Vale felt safer. Charles and Clement returned often with news. They'd recovered stolen goods and shared them with victims' families. Some called Harriet's story legendary, but she bristled at the title hero. She hadn't sought vengeance for glory, only justice and survival. Still, the nights brought no peace. Harriet woke often from nightmares, Thomas's face flashing before her gunfire, echoing in her ears. The children suffered too. Sarah startled at loud noises. Samuel refused to sleep without a light. Harriet held them through, their fear whispering that they were safe now, though part of her doubted it would ever truly feel that way. Yet Cedar Vale embraced her. Neighbors offered food, sewing jobs, and kindness. With help, she rented a small cabin and began building a quiet life. It wasn't the dream she and Thomas once had, but it was real. And in that reality, Harriet found something like strength, not in forgetting, but in enduring. Each day, Harriet found healing in motion. Tending the garden beside their small Cedar Vale cabin, she watched Sarah and Samuel help with clumsy hands and hesitant smiles. Their laughter, though quiet, grew stronger. The land wasn't the homestead Thomas had dreamed of, but it was theirs, a second chance carved from pain. Neighbors offered kindness. Harriet sewed for extra income and taught her children to read and count their progress, a tender reward for so much loss. Still, grief lingered. At night, Harriet often walked alone to the cemetery's edge, kneeling by the modest cross bearing Thomas's name. She whispered to him about the children's growth, about Scruff the cat, and about how she had faced Murdock in the canyon. "I hope you're proud," she said through tears. There was no dramatic closure, no fairy tale ending, only quiet resilience. Harriet could smile again cautiously. Life didn't erase what had been taken, but it offered enough light to go on. Thomas's memory stayed with her in every breeze, every sunrise, and every hopeful glance from their children. In the stillness of each evening, she realized they hadn't just survived, they were rebuilding. Life in Cedar Vale was far from idyllic, but for Harriet and her twins, it was a fragile, new beginning. In a modest cabin on the outskirts of town, Harriet found purpose in small routines, tending a garden, mending clothes, and teaching her children. Their stray cat Scruff followed them through rows of sprouts as laughter slowly returned to the home. Sometimes rumors whispered that Murdock might still be alive, but Charles and Clement assured her they'd buried the outlaw themselves. Still, the memory of the massacre haunted her, shaping every sunrise into a quiet triumph. Harriet taught Sarah to braid her hair and Samuel to carve wood animals, the rhythm of life, a salve for old wounds. On one crisp morning, Harriet stood on her porch, watching the twins chase each other under golden light. Scruff rubbed against her ankle as she whispered a promise to the dawn they would not just survive, but truly live. Murdock's terror would never define them. In the laughter of her children and the soil beneath her hands, Harriet reclaimed what had been stolen and proved that even in a land stained by cruelty, love could take root and bloom again. Thank you for joining us on this gripping journey through heartbreak, vengeance, and the unbreakable bond of family. Harriet Winston's tale reminds us that even in the darkest shadows of frontier violence, hope can grow strong and bright. Against the ruthless terror of bandits, she proved that love and courage endure. If Harriet's fight for justice inspired you, if you felt your heart pound when she confronted unimaginable danger, then help us keep her spirit alive. Like this video to show your support for her indomitable will, share it with friends who love true grit and unwavering devotion, and subscribe for more tales of hope emerging from tragedy. When we stand together just as Harriet did with her allies, we remind the world that resilience can triumph over cruelty. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay brave out there on the frontier.